357 Productions is very proud to present Dr. Ric Berman, who is the Prestonian Lecturer. Dr. Berman, this is your second trip to North Carolina. The first one happened earlier in the year, yes?
Yes, indeed.
Did you have a good time?
I had a fantastic time, thank you.
So, Dr. Berman, as the Prestonian Lecturer, why don't you just tell us a little bit about what a Prestonian Lecturer is and how that came about and how you came to be the Prestonian Lecturer? This was for 2016.
Yeah, it's a long story. The Prestonian Lectureship was started by a chap called William Preston, who was a great Masonic educator, but he fell out with the Grand Lodge of England. He fell out to the extent that he set up a rival Grand Lodge, the Grand Lodge south of the Trent. It doesn't sound very impressive, and it probably wasn't. But he reconciled himself, and he reconciled himself to the Grand Lodge of England, and he gave what was a quite substantial sum in those days, £300, to endow a lectureship. And the lectureship originally was based on his own teachings, which was a series of catechisms which he gave to lodges at the time. This was in the late 18th century. The lectureship fell into abeyance and was revived in around 1924. And since that date, there's been a Prestonian lecturer appointed every year by the Grand Lodge. And the theory is that the Prestonian lecturer chooses a subject of his choice, and that subject should entertain, it should educate. In my case, and I'm sure this is true with others, I was told what I should lecture on, and I was asked whether I would do a digest of my first book. My first book was The Foundations of Modern Freemasonry, which looks at the establishment of the Grand Lodge. It casts back to the 14th century, to the Black Death, to the Plague, and looks at how Masonic lodges developed over 4 centuries. And then in the beginning of the 18th century, how there was a step change. And the step change was introduced by, if you like, political and religious necessity. And the Hanoverian succession, George I, was under threat from James Stuart. And this was a serious issue. This was a serious issue for the Whig government. It was a serious issue for George I, and it was a serious issue for the 50,000 odd members of the Huguenot community who had fled France for sanctuary in England.
So the Prestonian Lecture is simply that's strictly done by the United Grand Lodge of England. He's appointed by them. It's not Quatuor Coronati.
No, Quatuor Coronati, which is the oldest research lodge in the world, has supplied most of the Prestonian lecturers. But the Prestonian lecturer per se is chosen by UGLE, is chosen by a committee that's appointed by by Grand Lodge, and the rubric, as it were, is that one gives a small number of formal lectures, if you like, official lectures, and then as many lectures on top of that as people want to hear, and at the moment, fortunately or unfortunately, it's running at about 1 or even 2 a week.
Wow.
Which is quite a big effort. And once one has become a Prestonian lecturer, one is a Prestonian lecturer for life. So even now, I'm, as it were, taking bookings into 2018 and 2019, and I have colleagues indeed who are doing exactly the same thing.
Outstanding. Doctor, you kind of went ahead and dove into the history a little bit of the formation of the Grand Lodge of England. Let's, if we have enough time, let's just let's just back up in history and kind of run up to the formation of the Grand Lodge, and then I want to talk about after the Grand Lodge.
Okay.
So Captain Campbell talks a lot, the North Carolina historian, and I talk about, and some of the other historians, all the things that had happened in, say, the 110 or 20 years leading up to the formation of the Grand Lodge of England, starting with James VI coming down and becoming James I, and then all of the things that happened with the royalty, and then over the course of the next 100 years, Charles being beheaded, and the Puritans, and Cromwell, and then Charles II is back. How much did all of that chaos, do you think, play into them deciding to form into a Grand Lodge? Any or none?
Well, it's neither any nor none. You need to go back a long way further. Okay, so the way I look at this, if you really want to trace the beginnings of Freemasonry in its current form, you need to go back to the 14th century. Okay, so
that's in the first book that I don't have here.
Which is in the first book, which you don't have. So I can strongly recommend you go buy it.
I will buy it. I will buy it, Doctor. I promise. I thought I had them all.
Never mind. So well, there's a summary here. So taking that, okay. So in the beginning of the 14th century, you didn't have Masonic lodges per se. You had religious guilds. But with the Black Death, you had a 40% mortality rate in the population. And with that came massive labor shortages. And with labor shortages came an increase in real wages for the first time. Yeah. Prices were pretty much constant. But with the Black Death, they rose. Labor prices rose. They rose massively. They doubled. And this was hugely significant. So what happened? The government tried to legislate to reduce wage rates. And you can't legislate away supply and demand. So wages still went up. Wages still went up. Not only did they go up, but the magistrates were given the power to impose wage rates. What happened? The lodge became a trade union. They negotiated locally to try and maintain the wage rates, the real increase in the wage rates that they had obtained over the last 50 years. The government didn't like it, the establishment didn't like it. But you see in the old charges a justification for this. And that is the beginning of Freemasonry. The tail end of the 14th century, the beginning of the 15th. You see the old charges coming in, the regulations that determine how a lodge operates, the regulations that set out exactly how Masons deal with each other.
So these would have been our operative
ancestors. These were operative ancestors. But over time, and it happens actually relatively quickly, they begin to invite in members of the local town councils, the sheriffs, the aldermen, the lord mayors. Why do they do this? Because these are the guys who have the power to control wages. These are the guys who are the magistrates. These are the people who determine what contracts are issued for building new churches, for building new city walls, new municipal buildings, and so on and so forth. So you have this integration between the lodge and the local establishment. Okay, and this continues for around a century or more. It's an evolving process. But at the same time, you have economic man. So what does economic man do? Well, if you're a master mason, if you're a small businessman training up entered apprentices and journeyman Freemasons, what do? Well, if times are bad, you don't want the competition of qualified Masons, because it's going to cut your earnings. So you're going to slow the process of approving entered apprentices and fellow craft. And if times are good, You're going to do exactly the same thing because you can exploit them because they're indentured labor. And this is exactly what happens into the 16th century and the 17th. The guilds become very powerful. They use their control of labor, their control of the supply of labor, to gain monopoly power in their local markets. I mean, it sounds, in some way horrible and in some ways obvious, but this is actually what happens.
But without a free market, weren't there only customers, the
There
church
was
and the
no
crown?
free. There was no free market.
So
No.
So who were they building for other than the church and the crown?
No. It's the church, the crown, and everyone else. People needed houses.
Yeah.
They needed, shops. Mason. I mean, this did not apply to just, Freemasonry, stonemasonry. This applied to carpenters, to every other trade. The guild controlled the supply of labor. Controlled the supply of labor through restrictions on entry. You had to become an apprentice. Through the time it took to qualify, become an apprentice, to become a fellow craft, and finally to become a mason. So the control of labor was if you like, embodied in the guild, in the lodge, with the acknowledgement and acceptance of the local town council. Why? Because the town council would receive a share of the fees for charters and a share of the fines for fining cowans or unqualified masons. So there was vested interest on both sides in making this work. And it was only in the late 17th century that this structure changed, when it was realized that economic development was actually being penalized by this sort of monopolistic structure. Now, that is the history of Freemasonry, but in the 18th century there was a fundamental change. And the fundamental change was the succession of George I, George the First.
But before you go that far,
Yeah.
just to back up just a little bit,
Yeah.
It seems like there was an awful lot of the Royal Society guys, the philosophers, the natural philosophers, the scientists, that joined the craft. And that would have been before the formation of the Grand Lodge, or leading up to the formation, I guess 30 years before, 40 years before.
Probably not.
But many of them were known Masons, weren't they?
I think you've got to draw a distinction between what was seen as patrons of Freemasonry.
Mm-hmm.
So members of a lodge, who were aristocratic or eminent patrons, who were adding their patronage, if you will, to a lodge. This was not spiritual Freemasonry. This was a lodge of Masons who wanted to ensure that they got paid, who wanted to ensure that their status in the community would be maintained. So, the argument: was Christopher Wren a Mason? Yes, in two senses. He was an architect, he was a stonemason, of course he was a Mason. But was he a member of a lodge? Yes. Why was he a member of a lodge? Because he was an influential guy, and because the lodge, in other words, the group of stonemasons that built St. Paul's Cathedral, weren't being paid. Inevitably, you weren't paid as a workman. How do you get paid? You use the influence of your patron. So you make sure that someone like Sir Christopher Wren, someone who's influential, is part of your lodge so he can lobby for you. That's why you had these guys coming into Freemasonry, not because it was a spiritual endeavor, but because they were influential people.
Well, that's disappointing.
It may be disappointing. It may be disappointing. But what you see, I'm afraid.
But that's the way it is.
That's the way it is. I'm terribly sorry. That's the way it is.
Okay.
I'm glad it's okay. That is still the way it is. But what you see over the course of the 14th, 15th, 16th century is a development. You see stonemasons evolving in an economic environment, in a political environment. It's the 18th century when things begin to change, when you have the establishment of a federalist structure with the creation of a Grand Lodge. And Grand Lodge is created principally for political purposes. You have Jacobite Freemasons in France using Freemasonry as a political tool. It's seen as a threat. And in England, promoted principally by the Whigs and the Huguenots, many of whom were also eminent scientists.
Tell us about the Huguenots just a little bit for the people that don't know the history.
Well, this goes back, you have to cast your mind back 150 years. The Reformation in the 16th century set Protestantism against Catholicism. Catholicism was the established religion, not just of the people, but if you like, of the state. It was the means by which the state would impose its power. What do I mean by that? I mean that there was no media. People got their knowledge through the pulpit, through the church. There was no education, independent education system. The church controlled education. The church controlled medicine. So if you're the king of France, you're sitting in Paris, how do you impose your control over your people? You use the church. So the Catholic Church and the Catholic political establishment are pretty much one and the same thing. And when Protestantism comes into France, at the beginning of the 16th century, 1530s, Catholic Church reacts very badly. Now, what are Huguenots? Huguenots are French Protestants. And we see the beginning of opposition to French Protestantism in the 1530s. It then goes into abeyance for a little while. And then in the 1560s, we have this event, the marriage of Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot, in other words, a Protestant, to a daughter of the King of France, a Catholic. The Catholic establishment is outraged. And they persuade the king to sanction the murder of a number of senior Huguenot aristocrats who are attending that wedding. The first attempt fails, but the second attempt succeeds. And there is a wave of anti-Huguenot, what I can only call genocide, which sweeps out from Paris across France over the course of a couple of months. I can't recall the date off the top of my head, I think 1562, but around that period. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and it's not misnamed. Estimates of the number of French Protestants killed vary, but range from 20 to 30,000 to up to 80,000, which is a vast number given the population in those days. And they're followed by subsequent acts of genocide over the next 50 to 100 years. To the extent that Protestantism in France is really constrained to a minute proportion of the population, some 750,000 by the end of the 17th century. Now, Henry Navarre does become king. He becomes Henry IV. He gives a degree of dispensation to the Huguenots. He converts to Catholicism because he can't rule otherwise. But he's succeeded by his son after his murder, Louis XIII, then Louis XIV, and they impose genocide almost as a state policy. And in the 1670s and 1680s, this culminates in two acts: the dragonnades, which is the imposition of French dragoons, so French soldiers, on Huguenot households, with all that entails, murder, rape
and murder incorporated.
Yep. And that's followed a few years later by Louis XIV terminating the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes was the original dispensation given by his grandfather, Henry IV, that gave French Protestants some limited rights. So with the Edict of Nantes revoked, French Protestants become non-people. You're either a Catholic or you have no rights.
So they flee.
They flee under penalty of death, because to be caught fleeing meant the noose or imprisonment, whatever. And of those 750,000, around 250, 300,000 flee. And a significant proportion come to England. And there they are very influential. In London, population in 1700, around 500,000, approximately 50,000 are French Protestants. And they are instrumental in building Freemasonry. So you have this...
And they are very pro-Hanoverian.
They're very pro-Hanoverian for obvious reasons. So you have this confluence of Whigs and also Huguenots. And the Royal Society at the time comes into the mix. Why does it come into the mix? Because one of the key figures in this process is Jean Theophilus Desaguliers, who is a protégé of Isaac Newton, and Desaguliers is the principal proponent of Newtonian thought, if you will. And a lot of the forward-thinking individuals of the time, the people who believed in toleration, in rational observation, judgment, these are the guys who were in the Royal Society at the time. And that was what Freemasonry embraced. It embraced toleration. It embraced objectivity.
Humanism.
Yes, humanism. Deism even. And for 20 years, that was the driving force. That was the driving intellectual force.
So from the beginning, from 1717?
From 1717...
For 20 years after that?
For 1717, for around 20 years after that, yes.
And what happened?
What happened next? What happened next was that the guys who were the main proselytizers of this radical Freemasonry got older. They began to die off. And English Grand Lodge has had phenomenal success. I mean, this whole concept of Freemasonry becomes adopted not just in England, in London, in the provinces, in Scotland, in Ireland, but across Europe. We see lodges now in Paris, in Madrid, even in Lisbon. We see them in Vienna in due course. We see them moving into Germany and so on. So Freemasonry becomes incredibly popular as an elite fraternal society. This is a period when Europe is really embracing the Enlightenment, but at the same time, Freemasonry offers this wonderful, intoxicating mix of Enlightenment thought, this ritual, a history that supposedly goes back to time immemorial. Of course it doesn't, but it supposedly does. So Europe loves this, because Europe in particular, aristocratic Europe, is absolutely focused on medieval ritual and at the same time on Enlightenment thought, and Freemasonry combines the two. Freemasonry is the fraternal club of choice for Europe's elite. And in America, you see it being adopted by, in the South in particular, by the plantocrats, by the plantocracy, by the elite in the South, the merchants, the planters, the lawyers, etc.
Malcontents. You can say it, Doctor.
I don't have to say malcontents.
Loyalists and Malcontents is one of
Loyalists
Dr.
and
Berman's
Malcontents
books.
is one of the books. But what you see, what you see in the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century, is the creation of the British Empire, the beginnings of the British Empire, and in America in particular, if you want to be fashionable, if you want to be a member of the elite, where do you look for your, if you like, the existential image? You look to London. You look to London because London is the centre of the empires. If you want to make money, you go to London. If you want to raise money, you go to London. London is the epicenter. And the preeminent club in London is Freemasonry. So you see Freemasonry developing on the eastern seaboard in the American colonies. They look to London and they emulate London. Now in the 1740s things begin to change. As I said, the guys that were proselytizing, the guys that were driving this forward get older, they leave, they die. And their place is taken by bureaucrats. Now at the same time, you have an influx of Irish migrants. There's horrendous problems in Ireland. The harvest fails. The climate is appalling for a number of years, and the rural poor die. And they seek to escape. They seek to go somewhere where they can survive. And the nearest place that is an island is England. And they go to England. Those that can afford it either go from England to America or go there direct. But the Irish in England, in a Masonic sense, are discriminated against. They're not accepted into English lodges. Principal reason being that English lodges are frightened of the impact that this would have on their charity funds. We've got tens of thousands of Irish coming in, impoverished in the main, and the charity funds are already stretched, so they don't want to let them in. There's also racism. There's a tremendous development in Irish or anti-Irish feeling in the 1730s, which is principally a function of the trade regulations that are introduced by England. You know, you can't introduce legislation like this in good conscience unless you at the same time denigrate those people that you're penalising. But the Irish are still coming in, and there's a history of Freemasonry in Ireland, both the Freemasonry that was introduced in the 1720s that followed English Freemasonry, but also the Freemasonry that had existed there beforehand. So the Irish, rejected by English Grand Lodge, established their own lodges in England. And in the 1750s, when the original Grand Lodge of England is really, at least temporarily, nosediving, the ancients establish the Grand Lodge of the Ancients. And there commences a period of some 50 years where the ancients and what are now called the moderns, the first Grand Lodge of England, are at loggerheads. Now, ancient Freemasonry is a very different form of Freemasonry. It's more accessible. Charity is compulsory. If you're a member of an ancient's lodge, you not only pay your lodge dues, but you pay your charity dues. And they introduce a series of innovations which have really quite a material impact. Most importantly, probably, the issue of membership certificates. Because armed with a certificate, you can go to a lodge in a different part of the country or in a different country and be accepted. And be accepted as a good man and true, as a man who's paid up his lodge dues and his charity dues, so is sound. And certificates weren't given out willy-nilly. They were given out if you were a good man and true. Now, for migrants, this was hugely valuable because, of course, you're traveling, you're in seek of work, and you want that support network. So what the ancients did, the ancients converted Freemasonry into an organization that was at the same time more spiritual and more of a friendly society, so more mutual, if you will. And this had a tremendous impact in the American colonies as Irish migration into America developed from the 1740s, 1750s onwards. You see this spread of ancient Freemasonry. Started in Philadelphia. The warrant for the constitution of the Grand Lodge of Philadelphia was issued by the ancient Grand Lodge in 1756. Within a decade, the whole of Pennsylvania Freemasonry was ancient Freemasonry. They turned their back on English modern Freemasonry. They embraced the ancients. And as Irish migrants came down through Philadelphia and elsewhere, they brought ancient Freemasonry into the upcountry areas of the southern colonies in particular. And this is particularly interesting. You see the dichotomy then, the schism between the East Coast, the Atlantic coast, with the moderns, and the interior with the ancients. And with the moderns identified closely with loyalism, with loyalty to George III. The ancients actually not necessarily Republican per se, not loyalist, or sorry, not patriot per se, but over time they become patriot. Over time they become patriot because the moderns are ever more identified with the ruling elites, with the British placemen. And you see this very clearly in South Carolina, where the provincial Grand Master of modern Freemasonry, Sir Egerton Lee, is president of the Royal Council. He's Attorney General. He's a judge in the various courts there. And he completely alienates the colony. There are very few that are loyal to Egerton Lee. In fact, there are so few that Provincial Grand Lodge ceases to meet, even before 1776. It ceases to meet, and a rival Grand Lodge is established. So in the 1770s in South Carolina, you have two Grand Lodges.
Right. I think you'll find the same thing in North Carolina, probably. Yeah. Although we had such a Scottish immigration coming into the middle part of our state that probably a lot of them were Scottish, but not necessarily chartered under Scottish lodges, because we Scottish are so doggone independent. They probably were doing occasional lodges and just figured they didn't need.
I don't think you need a lodge. You don't need a certificate to form a lodge. If they were Irish, then the warrant was vested not in a lodge, but in the master and the wardens. And if people had moved over from Ireland or England and had a warrant, they would retain that. The same was true of Scotland. So you had travelling warrants, and I think this is quite probably the case in both North and South Carolina.
Well, we're really thrilled, Doctor, that you've chosen. Can we announce that you're going to write a book about?
You can announce it, absolutely.
So the book "Loyalists and Malcontents" that Dr. Berman wrote is all about mostly about South Carolina.
It's mainly South Carolina.
And so he's going to do another book, and it's going to be about North Carolina. We have begged and pleaded and kicked and screamed and connived and somehow talked him into doing this, and we could not be more happy. The historians of North Carolina could not be more happy, and we appreciate you doing it so much.
Thank you.
We appreciate you sitting for an interview with us.
Yes, I hope it's going to be edited well.
And it'll be edited. Oh, Brown's used to editing our videos.
It'll need to be.
Doctor, we're thrilled that you're a friend of Masonry in North Carolina. I personally have a huge amount of respect for you. I appreciate so much what you have done and what you're going to do for North Carolina. So thank you for sitting down with us, and we appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Indeed, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.